Come spell weavers, reavers, rogues, and men-at-arms, and answer the call of adventure. Pick up your sword, your axe, your spellbook, your bow, your rulebook, and your dice, and join the forces of good in their eternal fight against vile monsters, conspiring min-maxers, horny bards, and blood-soaked murder hobos. Discover the treasure trove of role-playing games here on Rollin Bones. My name is Ryan Howard, and I shall be your guide. Good evening, Boneheads, and welcome back to Rollin Bones with Ryan Howard, where we are making old school young again. I'm your host and king of the Boneheads, Ryan Howard, and tonight I am joined once again by my good friend, AlchemicRaker. He is my go-to font of knowledge when it comes to all things chainmail, and so we're going to have a conversation tonight about movement and scale in RPGs that is hopefully going to help me unlock some of the secrets that I need to unlock to actually make Project Skeleton function as a decent role-playing game. I was told by someone on Twitter that apparently this is a boring topic to some people. Well, stick around because we're going to make this as not boring as anything ever could possibly be. This is going to be a great conversation. Raker, like I said, is a font of knowledge. This is all very interesting and important stuff. So I hope you guys will stick with us the entire time. And I'm sure you will, because this is Rollin Bones and we have fun on this show. So want to remind everyone before we bring Raker on to like, share, and subscribe. That is how you let people know what we have going on over here. Also want to remind everyone that you can find me on various social media platforms, including X and Instagram, where I am at Howard_Ryan Gregg. Instagram is, I just said that, at Howard_Ryan Gregg. YouTube is Rollin Bones. Twitch is twitch.tv/RollinBonesRyan. And Substack is rollinbones.substack.com. Substack is where I post some of my thoughts on gaming. There'll be an article coming some point here in the next week or so, topic TBD, but I'll be posting something, so you'll have that to look forward to. So without further ado, let's go ahead and bring on the guest tonight. You all know him and love him. Those of you who are in Basic Expert server, you guys know how awesome this guy is. Those of you who aren't and don't already know, he is the author, editor, compiler of the Old Lords of Wonder and Ruin, which is one of the best resources for chainmail that is available out there. He is the one, the only AlchemicRaker. Welcome back to Rollin Bones, man.
Thanks, Ryan. It's good to be here.
So, just as kind of a primer for tonight, as I told you when I asked you about this topic, and respect to the people on Twitter who mention stuff like this. This is not the first thing people think of as far as like a topic for discussion in role-playing games. But what I kept running into as I was conceptualizing Project Skeleton is this is something I need to solve. And this is a huge gap in my knowledge. And so who better to help me fill that gap? Who better to fill my gaps than AlchemicRaker? So let's go ahead and kind of jump into this. So I guess where would you like to start, since you were the leading expert here?
Oh dear. Well, I wouldn't say that I'm necessarily the expert on movement in war games, but having come from the background in role-playing games and digging into war games, because I could tell at some point that the war game influence on D&D was like very, very important in unlocking what the original versions of D&D are trying to teach you and how they're supposed to be played. So one of the first things that I was just outright told when I was trying to dig into war games was that movement is a hugely important stat in it. Like being able to determine engagement, the person who moves first or moves fastest gets to decide what the matchups are.
Yeah.
And that's the first fights. That's the first one that you're going to try to knock out of your opponents. So movement is hugely important in war games, and if you've played D&D at all, you know that these days 90% of what a character is their combat definition. So it gets overlooked a lot, but it's at the center of a lot. So
yeah,
when you get into war games, you will immediately start seeing stuff about fatigue coming up in regards to movement and with other stuff, but it's even in movement. So I want to start with a little interesting bit. When you're dungeon delving in D&D and you've got the old rules, you know that you might move for like 5 turns in a row. You're exploring for 50 minutes, which is 5 10-minute dungeon turns. And then on that 6th turn, you've got to rest.
Yeah.
And if you look at chainmail, or if you look at, we've got the Old Lord's page 4 here, in fatigue, movement causes 1 fatigue. I think it's just the next page there. Yeah. Movement causes 1 fatigue. And once you hit 5 fatigue, you have to stop and rest. The army has to stop and rest, which is those 5 movements and that 6th turn of rest.
Yeah.
And that's at the mass combat scale, and you see it in D&D and just the dungeon exploration for a small party. And it's just neat because those patterns pop up once you've heard about them. So, so my question that I wanted to put to you is, what are the scales of play in your game that you see happening? Because I just mentioned a couple. There's the like overworld exploration where maybe you have 5 malahexes. Maybe you have an outdoor scale separate from an indoor scale, the way that AD&D and chainmail do, where there's 1 inch is 10 yards, 1 inch is 10 feet. So yeah, what are you envisioning currently?
Yeah, so to kind of put the frames on what I want for skeleton, I am looking to really kind of like run the spectrum from individual small party play in like a dungeon environment or a just kind of small adventuring area environment, all the way up to mass combat at higher levels. So I want to be able to make that axe progression the way that you can in axe. So I see there being a need for kind of all variety of movement scales to accommodate those particular phases of the game. And then I want movement to actually matter in combat. Like you said, whoever moves first decides the matchups. I also want, at the smallest scale, individual positioning to matter as far as terrain differentials or flanking, and being able to surround someone, being able to box someone in. These are all things that I want to be able to accomplish in Project Skeleton. I want that kind of tactical aspect of where can you cut off exits for people, where can you create crossfires with ranged attacks. That's what I'm looking at, is really just kind of all scales of play, and then making movement more than just kind of a hand wave.
Sure. All right. So it sounds like a fairly standard array of we'll say scales of play.
Yeah.
So something that you can't separate from the topic of movement is time.
Right.
So what time scales do you imagine combat playing out in? And there's like the 6 or 10 second rounds versus the 1 minute rounds, for instance.
I mean, traditionally what I'm used to is 6-second rounds. More of the games that I've been playing recently have 10-second rounds, though. Um, and I think I like the idea of a 10-second round a little bit better. It seems to allow. It seems to make more sense than a 6-second round. 6 seconds seems too small, and also it's a very. I don't know. 10 is a nice round number. 6 is a little unwieldy. It's still it's an even number, but I like 10 better.
Sure. So it has to do with the amount of abstraction.
Yeah.
Of course, like you hear that about like, well, how long is the combat turn? There's abstraction there. And I was always a fan of like the 6 or 10-second turn. They were about the same for me personally. And the 1-minute turn sounded a bit absurd to me.
Yes.
Until I got to AD&D and Chainmail and OD&D, where the 1-minute turn is kind of the same thing, but you're less far away from the narration and the story aspect of D&D because you are like playing through an adventure together. And so how far are you from being able to get on with what's happening after this battle? And once you zoom out a little bit more, you get closer to that 1 minute, and it's like, well, let's just roll some dice and see who wins. And now I'm going to chase you down or not, and then we have separate mechanics for chasing and so on. So this is the topic of negative space.
Okay.
That I recognized recently, and I think it's very important in this conversation. So the longer the turns are, the more negative space that you have, and the more I can say, well, we're dodging around corners and stuff here. If we've got an entire minute, then movement is really abstracted in there too, because you're just kind of in this area. You're not going to stand absolutely still for an entire minute of combat, but you're generally in this area. And then as you get to the 10 seconds, you're more standing still, but you're not necessarily standing perfectly still. You're still moving around and so on. So it's not just your attacks are kind of abstracting, and maybe one attack in 10 seconds counts as a chance to hit. And
I think the way that just to kind of, I guess, break down my perspective on 6 and 10 seconds versus a minute. The way I think about a minute in terms of combat is a lot faster than people think it is, because most people have no experience with violence outside of movies. And so they think of combat in terms of battle scenes from Lord of the Rings or something like that. And from that perspective, it makes sense for a longer battle. But when you think about the way that combat happens in most tabletop games, you're looking at more the engagement level. And engagements are rarely longer than a couple minutes. And so if you're looking at like 1 minute of time at the engagement level at, squad versus squad, in a minute, you're talking about multiple things happening within that time frame. If you're looking at 6 to 10 seconds, it's the difference between if you're a fighter fighting 3 orcs, in a minute you would have attacked each of those orcs 5 or 6 times, I imagine, if not killed all 3 of them within a minute. 6 to 10 seconds, you're talking about individual strikes at that point.
So I'm going to keep talking about the 1 minute rounds just a little bit more. I know that you're focused on the lower combat rounds, and I'm not trying to change your mind on that.
No,
but
good.
Just an interesting thing of perspective, because we are talking about combining scales of play. So this might seed some ideas there. Is in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, the first edition at least, fighters, say we have a 4th level fighter. If they're in normal the standard combat, say with some monster, they're making 1 attack per round. I don't know if they start getting an extra attack around that level or not, but heroes are generally making 1 attack per round.
Yeah.
But fighters, if they're fighting weaklings like level 0 monsters or level 0 humans, then they're making 4 attacks per round. And that is more like those 4 orcs that you're killing in 1 minute. Versus whenever it's time to be more heroic, well, then that combat's going to last a lot longer because I'm only making 1 attack against a heroic opponent, but I could be slaying a whole bunch of weaker opponents. So, and that of course traces back to chainmail as well.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead, and then I'll say what I was going to say.
So yeah. So when you get to the 10-second combat and you're focused a lot on this idea of attacking other heroes multiple times per minute, and you lose a bit of that ability to kill a whole lot of level 0s in that same time scale, relatively speaking, because, well, if I'm making 4 attacks, it could be against a hero or an orc. So keeping those things in mind is like, well, maybe you have special rules or a cleave rule so that you can hit troops and keep slaying troops as long as you can kill them in 1 hit. There's different ways to handle that, but time is very important. And like, this topic is about movement, but those all have to be decided together.
Yeah.
One other thing, and then I'll hand this back to you, is you will likely want to have multiple scales of combat that are compatible with each other.
Yeah.
So you want to be able to have the 10-second combat for those heroic skirmishes that we know D&D to be and RPGs to be, as well as being able to throw an army in the backdrop of here and not have it all be DMPI. Like, you also want to be able to roll for the armies and decide how things go for them. And being able to connect those two is that's what chainmail did, actually. Is chainmail was able to have both. Like, here's some mass combat, here's some heroes fighting at the same time, and if they cross, there's rules for that too. So so yeah, what are your thoughts on
so kind of like what I'm seeing here is like you said, if you look at 1 minute combat rounds in based on what you said, where low level opponents you can take out as many as you can take out, or you specifically chainmail says a fighter fight, like a first level fighter fights like 4 men or something like that, or a fighter of a certain level fights as 4 men, versus when you're fighting an actual essentially like leveled up another hero figure on the other side of the battle. At that point, you're going more from, instead of individual attacks, to like sequences of attacks against each other, or exchanges back and forth of he strikes and the other guy parries, and then he recovers from the parry and goes in. I think I see what you're I think I see the difference here, and why a minute works kind of within that, or with that particular understanding of combat. Now, as to combat systems that scale but also intermingle with each other, one of the things that I really want to lean into with Project Skeleton is active defense. And I've conceptualized this on the skirmish level, or the like duel level. Anyone who read my dueling article knows that I've thought about active defense within the realm of combat. I want to incorporate that at scale while still realizing that even, once you scale up, you can't account for every single individual strike and every single response to that strike. And so what I would be doing at scale, I imagine, you still have the opposed rolls. However, it's essentially the role is deciding like control of the field at that point, or control of that individual line and their clash with the other line. So basically the attackers roll their attack, the defenders roll to defend, and then whoever comes out on top of that ends up kind of controlling that particular skirmish, or they have the upper hand in that particular clash there.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, and I don't even know if I'm communicating this idea well at this point. So I don't know like how well this is going to work at scale, but that's currently where things rest with my conception of combat and how it scales from one-on-one all the way up to army on army.
Sure. So the active defense, at least as you describe it, seems like it would fit pretty well at the skirmish level, the individual heroes fighting level. It seems like the kind of thing that wouldn't matter what you started zooming out to, say, the army versus army level.
Okay.
So, for example, in chainmail, whenever you've got this man versus man fighting, one person hits first, and if the other person survives, then they can attack back, right? Mm-hmm. It's got kind of that individual initiative thing going on. One attacks, the other attacks, and you've got that amount of precision. Once you go to the army versus army scale, then the attacks are resolving simultaneously. So you've got simultaneously resolve some casualties, and at the end of that combat, I don't want to say that casualties don't matter, because they do, but at the end of each round of melee, the armies will make a post-melee morale roll. And I don't remember what page this is on. They'll make a post-melee morale roll, page 8. And that roll is what makes the difference. The casualties factor into it, but whichever side is stronger during the post-melee morale roll is the one that stands their ground and keeps going. And the one that loses the post-melee morale roll is the one that gets pushed back or gets broken and they have to rally.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever the combat's happening at that scale, that's how the sergeant or the commander is going to be thinking, is I'm going to break their unit. It's not that I have to kill all of those people to get through them. It's that I need to clear the way so that I can get to this objective, or whatever he's trying to accomplish. And that's significantly different than how skirmish combat works. So it's a good thing that the battlefield combat is not the same as skirmish combat. And this is something where I know that there's a lot of arguments on Twitter with the bros about it. It's like, well, should you use chainmail with AD&D? And the thing about AD&D is that it's skirmish combat, and so if you use skirmish combat for a battlefield battle, you lose out on things like this post melee morale. You get a battlefield scale skirmish combat instead, and you can say it works well enough, and I know that they've made it work to good ends, mm-hmm. but if you want to be role-playing commander, then having to deal with armies and how they coordinate differently than just a couple of men on the ground is part of that game. So, so having an active defense in skirmishing, like you want to have, that makes sense. And whatever kind of active defense, or however you want to represent that at the battlefield scale, will probably look different. But, it can be like, what kind of defensive stance are they taking? Like, what defensive formations are they taking?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and what I'm seeing here is just kind of as a way to adapt my skirmish level into mass level. Instead of having it be defense, like attack versus defense, each side rolls, and then whichever side ends up rolling higher in a particular clash, they come out on top of that particular clash, and then morale roll from the loser to see if they are still holding their ground or if they are fleeing. And then that morale... I do want to factor casualties in at some point, like somewhere in there. Just let's say they are able to hold their ground. It will matter at that point how many casualties they've taken, because that will determine how well they're able to continue holding their ground. But I don't know if it makes sense to have a roll to see what they do after losing, coupled with how many casualties, or the percentage casualties that they take or something like that. That's something I need to continue working on, but I do see what you're saying as far as defense not necessarily mattering unless you are specifically calling for a particular formation. And the one that immediately comes to mind is the shield wall formation against archers.
Yeah. You've got shield walls against archers. You've got the pole arms against knights charging, right?
Yeah.
Cavalry charging. In chainmail, there's even I'm going to mispronounce this, but the lance knight, where they have special formations. They're hedgehog formation. And point pole arms in every direction. Doesn't matter what direction the unit's facing. And those are all significant. And just a 1 second side tangent. Representing different races of humans or different races of fantasy creatures, the ways that their armies fight differently is so interesting and should be represented if you're at that scale. It's like, well, these conform this way. These guys will never surrender because they're a religious order, and so on.
Yeah.
All that factors in. But getting back to the melee and the post-melee morale before we leave that topic, you'll notice in the post-melee morale outcomes table, there's a small chance that melee continues. And I'll mention that come back to that in a second. Every other result is they get moved back a little bit, they get moved back a lot. And then the first two results there are they get moved back in good order. And then below that, they get moved back and they're retreating, which is not in good order. Yeah. And they're being routed, or they just straight up surrender. All those lower cases, they have to rally. Like, you can't just give them commands anymore. You lose the ability to just give them commands and they listen. Yeah. And retreating in good order, distinguishing between those two things is something that the concept's not in D&D and role playing, but you're managing an army. If they're made to retreat, then they're going to take some % of casualties. I've seen war games where you skip straight to this post-melee morale step practically, and there's an extra column in there where it's, well, if they got moved back, pushed back half a move, then they also take 10% casualties. And if it's a worse outcome, then there's 20% casualties. And they just can fold that all in there if you really want to focus on other stuff, and casualties are the side thing. So
yeah.
My own opinion is the chainmail combat's really interesting, but it's really crunchy in places that I wouldn't have put the crunch.
Yeah.
And so it's an interesting because it has all these pieces, and we can observe it and learn from it, or figure out where else we want to put them instead.
Yeah.
So getting back to anyway, so all these army outcomes are movement, and that's part of the topic today, is this movement, and this is movement at the army scale of these things groups getting pushed back. Mm-hmm. And so I want to bring that back to skirmish scale combat, which is what players are going to be playing in. And the thing about chainmail is that their skirmish combat and their battlefield combat share the same ground scale. So 1 inch is 10 yards, and that's the same if you're skirmishing, or if it's an army fighting, or if you're doing both at the same time. So any scales that you want to be mixing, you will want to make sure that their ground scale matches, and that the length of the rounds match, and expect it to get more rough if you want to have 10-second rounds for your heroes, and you don't want to have 10-second rounds for your armies.
Right.
And so you could say, well, every 6 rounds of skirmish, then we do 1 round of army combat, and maybe that'll play okay. I'm not sure. In chainmail, just based on their fatigue, because I know you were talking about, like, fights don't last very long.
Yeah.
Most melee clashes in chainmail end after a single round, and a single round of melee is 1 minute.
Yeah.
And after 2 minutes, they've accumulated 4 points of fatigue. And if they charged, then that's an additional point of fatigue. So they charge 2 rounds of melee, they're tired. That's 2 minutes of fighting for like the battlefield scale combat. So,
I think you're really selling me on 1 minute combat rounds.
I'm sorry, go on.
Just like it makes sense as far as scaling up. I think it's just, I think it's a matter of making sure that once it scales down, essentially there's enough that goes on within a heroic combat round. Because again, chainmail has the specific statement that you fight as 4 men if you're a hero unit. Mm-hmm. So I guess it's making sure that works at the lowest scale as well as at the highest scale, because I see what you mean with essentially 10-second rounds at skirmish scale, kind of having a knock-on effect of making for complicated mass combat.
Yeah. So I don't want to discourage you from using the 10-second rounds, because I actually think that can be done pretty well if you can present it correctly.
Yeah.
So one difference when you leave chainmail and you get into D&D, D&D introduces hit points, and hit points are very much a heroic thing, right? You're going to take 4 hits before you go down, and in chainmail you get hit once, and it's not necessarily a kill; it's defeat, and then half of those are kills.
Yeah.
whatever you've agreed to. So, and in chainmail, fantastic combat is like a fight between two heroes or a fight between a hero and a dragon. I believe that those resolve not as melee rounds, but as the entire 10 minutes that a turn of chainmail is, which I think it's approximately 10 minutes. So it's like one army's movement is 10 minutes. One fight between the hero and dragon is approximately 10 minutes. You're going to roll the dice once, and you're going to see either the hero or the dragon survives that.
Yeah.
And chainmail's fantastic combat brings it all out into 2 rolls, and you've got a victor on one side or the other, or maybe they've both survived. Yeah. And that's very different from the man-to-man combat, which is what becomes our D&D skirmish combat, where in chainmail, I think each round of man-to-man combat is 1 minute. And so you can have a played-out fight between 2 heroes, and that's kind of on the side. And then once they're done with that, then you come back to, well, now we're playing the chainmail turns again, and we play the next chainmail turn. Mm-hmm. So if you think about the 10-second turns in Project Skeleton, then it does need to be presented as, well, if the hero is fighting orcs, well, then we're going to roll to see how many orcs he kills in one combat round. But if he's fighting another hero, then we might do this more active defense back and forth. And this is like a hero versus hero moment. And we're going to start whittling through each other's HP, right? Mm-hmm. And we might have several back and forths to see who wins the momentum. And then we're going to go back to the higher scale, right? Because like you zoom in, you start playing at the battlefield scale. And then whenever it gets to the heroic combat, you play at the heroic combat scale. And then you come back out, and being able to seamlessly do that. So, so I definitely think it can be done, but when you're designing it, you do need to account for that and be like, here's when you're going to bring it in. Here's whenever you zoom back out again. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
And what I'm looking at with, I'm not using HP in Project Skeleton. I'm using wounds. Mm-hmm. So at the heroic scale, you're looking at being able to take multiple wounds with, essentially like the highest number of wounds that a super high level character or, a crazy monster like a dragon or a beholder or something like that would be able to take would be like 5. So 5 wounds is the toughest thing out there, with each wound having some kind of penalty based on where the wound is. And then at the lowest level, your kind of minion creatures, your low level orcs or your men at arms or something like that, they take 1 wound and they die. So that's the system I'm looking at as far as like, hit points versus wounds. I'm on the wound side of things because I don't like hit point bloat, and I like the idea of there being a mechanical consequence each time you are hit, because I think that's more realistic. So that's what I'm looking at as far as the skirmish scale or the heroic scale. And I don't know that. I think what 4th edition did with minions was you take the look at the like average orc stat block, and then minions, like if they take 15 damage, that means there's like 15, or if they have 15 hit points, that means there's like 15 orcs or something like that. I've not played 4th edition. I could be completely wrong about this, but it's essentially like for each individual orc, if it has 15 hit points, that means there'd be 15 minions or 15 minion orcs there. And so the damage that you do would apply to, that many orcs, and that's how many you kill in a round. maybe what I would do there is give armies like essentially this is one unit with the number of wounds that would represent how many soldiers would be in that unit. So if there's a squad of 10 men at arms would have 10 wounds. And if you're able to deal 10 wounds, then you've wiped out an entire squad or something like that. Maybe that's too close to hit points. I don't know. Again, this is part of why I wanted to have this conversation, because it's at scale. It's like, where did these ideas break down?
Yeah. So in chainmail, you're not necessarily tracking wounds, but the language starts looking awfully suspicious. That say you had 20 men and you're playing at 1-to-1 scale, and those 20 men are going to fight something. Well, they're going to make 20 attacks in mass combat. And by 20 attacks, what I mean is that they're going to roll 20 hit dice. And why is it 20 hit dice? It's because each man has this chance to hit. And if the other side is also rolling 20 hit dice, then each one of their hits is going to kill one of our men. And for each casualty that our men take, like say 5 of our guys die, well, then I have to take away 5 hit dice before I roll again. And now those hit dice are basically the army's HP. And those are the wounds that you're talking about.
Yep.
It comes full circle. And that was the hit dice. And so why do heroic characters have 4 hit dice? It's because they attack as 4 men. That means they're rolling 4d6.
Yeah.
And it's elegant when you're able to do it like that and say like, well, roll the d6 and 6s get kills. And if your troops are stronger than them, then you hit on 5 and 6s and so on. So, and that's the way that chainmail does it. Sorry, I had something else I was gonna say where I got on the hit dice tangent. I'm sorry. What you were talking about right before that, though. You were talking about wounds having different wounds causing specific effects based on what the wound is.
Yeah. So
heroes.
Yeah. So if you deal a wound to a hero, basically you have to roll to see what that wound is, like where, like essentially hit location. Where did you hit? And then based on where you hit, it'll have a certain effect on combat moving forward.
Yeah. So for that, and I don't want to get too deep into it, but if you want to look back, and what D&D does for that is the air combat, the aerial combat system in OD&D has something like that, where depending on the direction that a flying creature gets attacked from, there is a table of like, well, what part of the body gets hit and what penalty results from that. Like, do they start plummeting because you got their wings or whatever? So, so you can see a little bit there. So I did want to bring up, we've talked about fatigue, but there's also encumbrance.
Yeah.
And at the skirmish scale, we're pretty familiar with what encumbrance means, with like, well, what kind of armor you're wearing, and that might slow your individual character down. Right. And you probably have some ideas already for that. So I did want to bring up, when you're looking at the army scale, there is still, there's multiple kinds of encumbrance. So there's the encumbrance of what your troop type is. So heavily armored troops will move more slowly. And that's whenever you're having like a battlefield skirmish. So you might have like this backdrop of units moving in, and you've got some heroes fighting over some key point on that battlefield. Once you zoom out even more than that, because you're playing more of the domain game, and you've got war campaign going on, because you don't just always have 2,000 standing men.
Right.
You've drafted 2,000 men, and they've got a job to do, and they're going to be working towards that end. And if you just keep them standing around doing nothing, they're going to get pissed off and desert, and go back home or go to the other side or wherever. And if you're not feeding them that entire time that they're standing there, then they're going to start deserting. And the movement speed of armies on the campaign scale is affected by supplies.
Yep.
And supplies are something that we like to hand wave away. I don't really want to focus on the supply chain, but it's another one of those considerations that makes battlefield combat more interesting. And Chainmail has this where somewhere behind the enemy lines is going to be their supply. And it's kind of this bonus win condition thing where if you can manage, it's like getting your pawn across the board in chess. If you can manage to get back there, you're going to scare the enemy side. And they're going, like, part of the enemy is going to retreat from the battlefield to catch up with you because they don't want their supplies raided. That's their food.
Yep.
And they care about that. And I heard this number somewhere, I think from Henry Hyde's Wargaming Campaigns, which is an excellent book. And I suggest that you read either Henry Hyde's Wargaming Campaigns or Tony Bath's Wargaming. Read at least one of those, because it'll seed a lot of ideas in your head. So whenever you're designing RPG rules for the domain level, you can be thinking about that. It's like, well, the army will have supplies that they're managing, and it's not that you have to track where they are exactly, but armies are going to move more slowly because they have to care about their supplies.
Yeah.
And when you write your rule book, that's the kind of thing that can go in negative space. So I don't want to track where exactly the supply lines are, but I can abstract it to say, well, the army does have to move along roads because the supply chain has to use roads.
Yeah. And
if the enemy manages to cut off the road that's connecting me to Allied territory, then my supply chain's been cut off, and I'm going to start having penalties until I can restore that.
Yeah.
And that's very abstracted, but it still means a lot. And you can explain that to the DM. It's like, here's what it represents. Probably isn't going to happen, but it can happen, and here's what's going on if it does. But we don't have to like codify, well, here's how the supply wagons move, and here's how you move, see, like all 10 of them. Like, you don't have to track all of that. But being specific about what's in the negative space at each scale of play, and like part of movement is what are you tracking at that level? Because you're not tracking the position of 2,000 individual men, you're tracking the position of one army.
Yep.
So knowing what you're tracking at each scale, the size of the thing that you're tracking at each scale. So when you're at the domain tier, you're just tracking armies, and that way you only have 4 to 8 things on the map that your player has to track, and that's not going to overwhelm you as the DM, which also means that the movement rules are going to get a bit messy whenever the players are like, well, the domain says that we can only move this far, but if I'm thinking about the hero's movement, well, we can move 18 miles a day, but the army can't move that fast per day. Why not? It's like, well, you're not bound by the same things. So right. The domain rules are for the armies. So yes, you can move 18 miles per day because you're the heroes.
Yeah. Well, and also, like you said, as heroes, if there's 5 or 6 of you, you don't have to necessarily worry about where your supplies are because you can carry supplies for 5 or 6 people between 5 or 6 people. And
Mhm.
if you run out, you can hunt or forage for 5 to 6 people. You can't hunt or forage to feed an army.
I mean, you could pillage the local territory for a little
Yes.
bit, yeah, but yeah, it's very different. It's very different situations there. So
Yeah.
considering in an RPG, and this is where you get where it becomes different from a war game, is that the RPG wants to know, well, what is what is the party doing when they're traveling across the domain map,
Yeah.
and the war game tends to leave that out. So,
hmm
um,
Yeah, and you mentioned supply lines, which are interesting because yeah, you don't if you get into, like you said, tracking individual wagons of supplies and how fast they're able to move, then you're at that point the people who accuse us of being spreadsheet monkeys have a point.
mhm.
But um there is something to this notion of having secure supply lines behind you or around you as you're marching, and the longer those lines get, the more vulnerable they are to attack.
Mhm.
Um, because that's an interesting thing to think about. Uh, at that scale, if you are able to draw a force further out away from the supply lines and then come in behind them and cut off those supply lines, that like that's why we play these kinds of games, to do stuff like that. That's the kind of thing that has a player sitting there going, "Ee," which is
Exactly.
yeah,
And and so in first edition D&D, when it's describing the 1 minute combat rounds, and it's saying, you're going to roll to hit once per round, and here's what it means, and it goes into detail, like, well, you're trading blows, and uh, it and it explains why it's abstracted that way.
yeah,
Um, but but then it says, but this is negative space. Like you fill this in, but it is the realm of fiat, and here's the spirit of that fiat.
yeah,
So when you go to the domain play and you find those negative space where it's like this, we're RPG people, we're not tracking 10 supply wagons here.
yeah,
So here's negative space, but here's what's in that negative space, because the heroes are going to want to come interfere with this. They're going to
yeah,
want to blow up the bridge, and the supply is going to be cut off, and now you need consequences. And the DM's only going to understand that when you've explained, well, why are they moving slowly? Why does interfering with the route that brings, like, that connects them with allied territory, why does that matter? It's because the players can interfere with that, and so you get to be a little bit of, a war game nut or history nut or whatever, and tell the DM these things, because the more the DM understands about that, the better they can run that.
yeah,
There's a pretty famous or well-known story uh, about the early wargaming where you have this referee that can just make rulings. It's not all in the hard rules.
yeah,
Where there's two armies and they're on opposite side of a river, and the one side think that they're safe and they'll be safe for a while.
mhm,
But that night, the opposing army asks the referee, like, there's this barn that's right next to this river. Can we cut it down and make a bridge? And the referee says, yeah. Now, there was no rules in that war game that specified how many planks of wood are in a barn, and here's how much it takes to build a bridge. But the referee knew enough where it's like, yeah, there's enough material there to construct a bridge out of,
mhm,
and you want to arm the DMs with that kind of knowledge, and that's where reading something like Henry Hyde and Tony Bath are going to be valuable to you, because even if you're not building a detailed war game like they describe, you can still fill your book with, here's why these negative spaces are important. So when your players are doing this, it becomes that real in the game world for them, and the players are able to tinker with things, because like prior to this, I wouldn't have known about exactly how supplies work, or details like for every man that's armed, and like you say that there's 2,000 men that were drafted. Well, there's that many people, there's that many more men that are maintaining the supply lines.
Yep.
And back in camp, and you just write that in the side because the players are going to do something, and the DM needs to know, like, well, is camp abandoned? No, there's like people cooking and maintaining the camp while the army's out, and those are kind of like soft rules,
yeah.
right? Where the spirit of the game's maintained, and the fusion of the different scales of play requires a good definition of that negative space.
Mm-hmm.
And I say this in contrast to someone who wants to define all of that space. Like if you want to pull out the spreadsheets and connect all of those dots exactly, then you might go for something like X, right?
Yeah.
And I don't say that to be mean about X. Like it has it all calculated out there for you. And if you don't want to do that, then you need to say, well, here's where they connect, and here's what's in that space if you happen to need it.
Yeah.
And that's very important for combining these scales the way that I believe that you're trying to do that. Mm. And which scales of play are being used simultaneously is something that we broached earlier, where skirmish combat and battlefield combat might be used simultaneously. So they need to be pretty clearly connected of like, well, what's a 1 minute combat round? Do we want to subdivide it for heroic combat? But that those 1 minute combat rounds even are not domain scale combat.
Right.
Right. And so it's like, here's things that are going to be completely separate. Here's things that need to be more compatible. And so when they have to be used simultaneously, when you've got scales that are meant to be used simultaneously, then you also want their movements to be measured as well, because you're having to deal with the time and movement. So it's like, in 1 minute of combat, my skirmisher running from the army, I need to know that he can move 12 inches and the army moves 9 inches, right? Because they're playing on the same scale battlefield.
Yeah.
So,
right. Go on. Some of this gets into like out of combat movement versus in combat movement, because, when you're talking about an army marching, that's the kind of thing that's, you're not going to spend an entire session tracking how far an army marches, just because, again, like with chainmail scale, you move 12 inches, that's pretty much all that your army can do. So, yes, we're going to move 12 inches north, and that's what they're doing if they're outside of combat. And then you move on to something else.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so you could say that chainmail is about mass combat, but chainmail is not about domain scale play. Chainmail is not about how far does an army move in a day. It's about how far does an army move on a battlefield.
Yeah.
In relation to active combat situation. Yeah. Right. And so, and that's where there's more of that abstraction.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like, well, even for heroes, you can say, here's your battlefield movement rules, here's your dungeon exploration movement rules, and every sixth round of exploration you have to rest. Yeah. And here's why. Or we say that you don't have to rest every 6 rounds, but your movement is slower when you're exploring because you're also resting sometimes. And so you have to define why is it being abstracted there? Because then they're going to say, well, what happens if I want to march an extra hour each day and I can get there faster? Well, the thing is that each day of movement on the map, you're also setting up camp and sleeping, Yeah. And yeah.
it's one of those things you kind of once you introduce stuff like that, you do want to give players the option to gamble with the expectation of, yes, you can get there faster if you march an extra hour, but if you run across the enemy, um, if you run across the enemy in marching that extra hour, your men are going to be tired, and that's going to have some kind of mechanical effect on your ability to actually engage in this pitched battle. So again, it's something to like you said, it's something to consider because correct me if I'm wrong, there is an option to not rest on that sixth round, and it does have a mechanical effect on you if you don't take that sixth round to rest.
Right. It's as soon as you have the 5 or more fatigue, then there's a lot of penalties for when you're in combat. So
Yep.
if you're on that 5th round and you are fatigued, and then someone comes and aggroes you who's not fatigued, well, now you're at an instant disadvantage, and you can keep pushing yourself and being extremely vulnerable, or you can stop and rest.
Yeah.
And so there's another gap that's in war games that RPGs demand that you get more specific about, because there's cases in war games where they'll say, well, units will only move whenever they're like, you can only really control units whenever they're in good order, and they're in close order. So like they're close together, as opposed to being in like skirmish order. And a wargamer will understand that if you've got a unit that's in open order or in skirmish order, those are actually elite units. Those are highly specialized units that are trained to be able to operate without a sergeant yelling at them.
Yeah.
The entire time. So when you're reading through chainmail, they'll just explain that you can't move through woods because you would have to break your order.
Yeah.
There's things like that come up. And so you just wouldn't do that. It doesn't make sense to disperse into open order where then your enemy can come and just crush you, right? To a wargamer, that makes sense. It's strategically bad idea most of the time.
Yeah.
But it comes up all the time if you're in role-playing games, because you've got a party of heroes, so they're always in skirmish order.
Yeah.
And they want to move through the woods, or they want to take their men through the woods because they're going to sneak around like heroes are going to do. They're going to want to sneak through the woods in open order. And chainmail pretends that open order doesn't even exist. So what happens then? And I was pretty good about like, leave the rules of chainmail as they are. Don't touch it at all. But one thing that I added in on page 5 is rules for a unit that is in open order, and it describes like you're operating at a significant disadvantage, but there are movement benefits to it. Like it's not that you would never do it; it's that you can, and you can move through certain kinds of rough terrain, and then you would have to spend another turn to regain your close order and continue on.
Yeah.
Well,
and it's one of the advantages to having some kind of system for open order is there are, especially if you're going up against a force that is larger and more organized than your own force, there are advantages to being able to draw that force, essentially like make them go into the woods to find you. Kind of that that Robin Hood, or that, the Patriot is the first thing I think of. Benjamin Martin drawing the British into the woods to come looking for him, and then he's able to essentially take on more men than he would in a stand-up fight because he's used to those woods, and you're on his home turf there. you want to be able to create that to a certain degree in RPGs because that is a cool
Mhm.
moment, and that's what RPGs are designed for more than war games, is to create those cool moments where you can then zoom in on this particular battle going on in these woods where you've lured a column of knights or you know men at arms into this particular area, and now you're picking them off one at a time, and you get the Rambo moment.
Right. Um, and yeah, so yeah, your heroes would be an open order skirmish sort of thing.
Yeah.
Or if you've got some archers, right? And your archers are pretty weak, but they can harass people from a distance.
Yeah.
And they might want to retreat into the woods. And it's defensively advantageous to them because I'd love nothing more than for the close order enemy to break their ranks and you know, try to find us in the woods where who are on a more even footing.
Yeah.
So there's these exceptions in war games where the wargamer wouldn't want to use it, and Gygax left it out of chainmail, but it's worth including in RPG rules whenever you are skimming the war game for interesting bits. Is that you'll notice that some war games will have open order, some won't. Well, include that because it matters to the RPG gamer.
Yeah, and this is one of the things. We all have kind of embraced this notion of RPGs are war games. RPGs are a type of war game. They are not a pure war game. And so there has to be a certain understanding. You're not going to, if I were to set out to create Project Skeleton to be the perfect RPG and the perfect war game, I'd have to develop two games simultaneously and then try to fit them together. And so the idea is to essentially make what is an RPG first that works at a war scale so that you can naturally take characters up to that scale, and maybe that will come with more abstraction than a pure wargamer is comfortable with, but it's it's a trade-off that has to be made mechanically to make these two things fit together, in my opinion. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
No, I agree. You have to decide what you want the experience to be.
Yeah.
And so like for the RPGs experience that I'm aiming for, that I'm designing on the side, I'm recognizing that I want a lot of it to be what you might think of as more the D&D type and the type of stuff that you're going towards. But then I also want the domain game, and what should the domain game look like? And I'm thinking of something that looks a whole lot more like diplomacy than like D&D, where instead of measuring distances, I'm tracking the map by regions, and an army can move through one region per season or something like that. That's what diplomacy does. So that's what I'm looking at. And why would you do that? It's because I want the experience of domain play to be more like that. Like I don't want it to be about, well, do you have 2,000 troops or 1,500 troops? Because all the pieces on a diplomacy board are of equal strength, and what matters in diplomacy is the diplomacy, like the deals that you've made with the other players.
Yeah.
And that's what shines on a diplomacy board. And the armies themselves are rather equal. And so you have to decide how you want to connect those.
Yeah.
And so it's like, well, certain places on the map are the supply centers, and each one of those can have an army. And that's like everything I'm saying is just straight out of diplomacy. But if you wanted to try to hook those up to D&D, they're they're completely stuff. They're completely different games that like you're trying to mash together, and you can pursue that intentionally. And there's a lot of negative space in there that you have to accept, where it's like, well, I'm not counting the gold when you're at the domain level. At the domain level, I'm thinking I've got 3 cities and 3 armies, and so it is about the experience that you want for each mode of play. So you know your different modes of play. You have to identify them. So you want the skirmishing and the heroic combat. You know what you want that to feel like. You want that active defense, that back and forth. There's a lot of strategy there, and it's very satisfying to do. And that's one mode of play. And I want that to mix with some army in the background, battlefield stuff, and all of that. All of those scales of play can be in one mode of play. But then you have to completely switch to another mode if you're going to do something like diplomacy, or if you're playing cyberpunk. Once the netrunner pulls out their hacking stuff, like that's just another mode of play, you know. Or the assassin in first edition D&D, their ability to assassinate isn't something that you just pull out on the battlefield. Like that's a mode of play for the assassin that comes into play, not really at the table, but in the background. So identifying those experiences and recognizing that an RPG can host multiple modes of play, but they are developed separately. You know, you're not doing them all at the same time.
And as we're kind of reaching the end of our time here, there's a couple of comments in chat that I want to highlight and talk about here. Start with this one from Rex Teal. X-Dude sold me on the idea that RPGs are war games and war games are RPGs. Yeah, I mean, neither of us are denying that that's true. I think what it comes down to here, again, is that concept of scale. RPGs are war games at a different scale than your traditional war games. And war games, you are role-playing, but you are role-playing... Again, it's a different role that you are playing than what most people consider a role play. Because when you are role playing in a war game, you are role playing as a commander, not necessarily soldiers on the battlefield. Although you could if you wanted to, but again, at that point, you're mixing scale in kind of an odd way. But yes, like these ideas are not incompatible with each other. It's just a matter. I think what we've landed on here is it's a matter of understanding what happens at these different scales and how these mechanics fit together and differ from each other.
So role-playing in war games, when I was digging into chainmail and I was reading the rules for catapults, and there's so many things in war games that I always told myself, like, this isn't the kind of stuff I want to do. Like pulling out a ruler to start doing combat just is insane to me. But I clearly got there, right? So looking at how catapults work in chainmail, and to fire a catapult in chainmail, you have to be hands off, and you have to say, well, I want to fire it so many inches ahead and so many inches to the side. And so you have to call how you're aiming it, and then you can pull out a ruler and measure it. And if you sat a player down at the table and be like, oh, yeah, I'm going to man the catapult, and the DM's going to say, all right, how far are you going to shoot it and how much to the side? Like they were playing the guy firing that catapult. And that's actually pretty satisfying. It's like that's role playing in the middle of the game. You don't get to pull out your ruler and measure it until you've made the call as the guy firing the catapult. And like that's spot on. So there is a lot of role playing and wargaming and vice versa. And that's a completely different spiel and topic.
Another one from Rex Teal here, kind of going back a little bit. Chainmail style combat system would probably support the action of fiction like Berserk. And this is really what it comes down to as kind of a thesis of what I want Project Skeleton to be. Berserk is like my model for everything. It's essentially become the measuring stick by which I measure all other things. And so being able to replicate Berserk is that's what I want to do, because Berserk has everything, and yeah, that's what I'm aiming for. That's the lofty goal that I have for myself.
It's such a great aesthetic. Like it's such a great setup there. And I'm going to push chainmail specifically here and not just war games as a whole. Chainmail, if you play chainmail and OD&D and you really lean into the chainmail side of things, your heroes are even more heroic than if you played OD&D. And by that I mean after 10 minutes, you've regained all of your HP. Like heroes are that strong. It's like to take down a hero, they have to take 4 simultaneous hits, not just 4 hits cumulative over whatever. Like 4 hits take them down, or they're back and they're going to fight again at their full strength. And that's super heroic and fantastic. And chainmail also had the stage that you want, that you think is a very narrative stage, where the heroes are fighting in the foreground and the army's fighting around them, and the armies aren't going to overtake the heroes until the heroes get done with each other first.
Yeah.
And that rule is in chainmail. Like it's narrative exactly like that. Like the last person of an army to die is the heroes that are in it. So all the men will die around them first, and they'll be the last one standing, and then the army will overwhelm them. Yeah. So you can absolutely codify that as rule system in an RPG to gain that cinematic effect.
Yeah. And then Antanius Verdum here in chat. While this conversation is more dry than the other stream going on, I think I generally prefer it. More information, less bald people. That's right. On Rollin Bones, we not only have the intellectual firepower, we also have all of our hair. So suck it, Dunder.
I'll be catching up on his stream tomorrow.
Yeah. And then Tag 1080 has a good point here to kind of end things on. Wargaming is an intellectual hobby. It can be fun to do silly, willy-nilly things with your friends, but it's also satisfying to master a complex system. And that's, you've mentioned this earlier in the stream, where chainmail is crunchy in areas you wouldn't necessarily like it to be crunchy. This is one of the things that I keep coming back to. Complexity is not a bad word for me anymore. The question is, where does the complexity need to be? What needs to be complex and what doesn't need to be complex? And finding that out, cracking that code, I think ultimately is the secret to making a successful role-playing game system. Understanding what can be abstracted, what doesn't need to have like every single thing accounted for, and what does. And so, like, honestly, that is an intellectual challenge, and that is something that is very intellectually satisfying if you pull it off correctly. And so, ultimately, that's where I'm landing, is I need to find things. I need to do a little bit more digging and find what needs to actually be accounted for and what can be abstracted, or at what level can certain things be abstracted.
Absolutely. This is one of the things where like the Bruasar mantra is spot on, where try, like, use all the rules, even the rules that the gross nerds skip. Like, you've got to try those rules and see where, like, is there juice in them? Is it worth the squeeze? And that's basically what my entire experience was with chainmail. Is the things that I liked the least upon first review of chainmail. One of the things that stood out was post melee morale. It's like, that just looks horrible. That's got to be one of the least interesting things here. And now it's like I would drop everything and keep that. It's that important, and maybe not in that exact form, but that concept was just the most important thing. And yeah, digging through all the old rules, there's so much great knowledge out there.
Yeah.
And finding the right crunch is what you're looking for. It's my thought that role-playing games are like the imagination play, the playing pretend for grown-ups. It's like, well, we don't normally do that, but then we call it a role-playing game and we'll do it. It's because we've gamified it and gave rules that were around the table we're all collectively invested in. And wargamers had the right idea there. It's like, okay, we're going to play pretend armies. And well, now we want to make it individual characters, and that's role-playing games. Finding the right mechanics to make that experience the most enjoyable is what this whole thing is about. Is like, well, I don't want to track these things, but I do want to track those things, because tracking whether or not you bought a tent is the most meaningful thing that we can do here. Because now I feel like every choice I make matters. Yeah. Right. And you won't get any more immersive of an experience than, whether or not I bought iron spikes matters in this game whenever I go dungeon delving. Now it's creepy because the experience was supposed to be like inspired by horror. And like, yeah, the experience of it all. Yep.
Yeah. And again, like, you know, we had a whole conversation around just that one topic of did you bring a tent or not? But yeah, having giving the players access to the mystery mouse tool. We both have young kids, so I know that reference isn't lost on you, but that again, you're giving them the answer to a problem just whenever they encounter a problem, versus here's what I have. How can I use this to solve this problem? Or now that we know that this is a problem in the future, when we come to this, we know, hey, we should probably have something in case this comes up again.
Right. So, and maybe not every game wants to have that experience. Right. Like I would argue very strongly that D&D wants to have that experience. But if your game doesn't have dungeon delving and it doesn't have that horror aspect to it, maybe you want a more survival aspect to it because you're doing something like outdoor survival. Well, then the tent's still going to matter, but other things might matter less. So it does matter what experience you're going for. But once you make that into a mechanic, then there's a mechanic. Have you bought a tent? And then it starts to matter. And that's the experience. That's the mechanic that makes this imagination play start to matter, so that adults can get invested in it. Adults enjoy it because we've made some rules out of it. And now, like, we've all agreed to play that. And someone forgot to buy a tent and we're going to laugh at them. And the DM's going to say, well, no, really, it mattered. And everyone's going to get all horrified. And you've got a really cool adventure coming right up.
Cool. Well, unfortunately, we are at time, and so this is where we're going to have to wrap up tonight. But Raker, thank you so much for coming on again and discussing this with me. You've given me a lot to think about, and I think I have the tools at least to unlock this problem and get that much closer to making Project Skeleton something viable.
Awesome. It's the goal that we all have, right? We all imagine that. Every DM is like, they have this toolkit of everything they've read so far, and they're going to make the best thing. So yeah, I hope I was able to give you a lot of ideas there. And yeah, good luck on your project.
Thank you. All right, guys, that's going to do it for Rollin Bones this week. Next week, we will be talking about classes and skills and the combination thereof and how I am looking to solve that problem in Project Skeleton. PowerPoint's coming back. I enjoyed doing that last time, so we're going to do that again. Yeah, I think it makes for a more structured conversation that way, especially when it's just me on here. But that's what we're going to talk about next week is classes, skills, and the combination thereof that I am targeting in Project Skeleton. So hope you guys are excited to see that. Tune in next week to find out what we're going to do there. Until next time, though, whether you rolled a 1 or a 20, I'm so glad that you rolled your bones with me, Ryan Howard, and I will see you guys next time.